we're going to open this up, and the ground rules for this part of our conversation are: when you ask a question, please say it loudly, and tell us who you are and what your affiliation is, and do please actually ask a question. So who'd like to start? Yes, the gentleman in the striped shirt.
I was wondering, just looking back on my high school education, what would be, I guess for all of you, sort of 5 or 10 books you would say in English that you would want students to read by the time they graduate? Say help me give us so we can.
I'm not sure it's fair to do that on the fly. Most people might want to write down their list.
I'm going to write down your list.
You can. We won't hold you to the 10, but how about 1 or 2 essentials from everybody?
Well, go ahead, teacher.
I mean, I would say this, that that there are certain foundational texts that one needs to know American history and American politics. And, you know, part of them are the obvious and somewhat traditional ones, like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers. But they also should include things like the letter from the Birmingham jail. And I think one of the virtues of the Common Core's approach to deep reading is that it should encourage history and social studies teachers, rather than giving kind of bowdlerized secondhand interpretations of those texts, to actually work with students in engaging those texts in a primary fashion. I think there's probably a great deal more than 10, but there are ones I think that, you know, that one could have a fairly broad consensus should be covered.
Anyone else want to address the book question in short order? And then we have a number of other questions. Ross. Sorry, we're at a microphone.
I just really quickly, and I could name some that I think sort of are in this Venn diagram of great literature and open up conversations about America. And so the To Kill a Mockingbird and All the King's Men and there's lots, and Huckleberry Finn, and the reason I decided to mention, I thought there was such an interesting research came out very recently about reading literature and the distinction between what the kind of capacity it creates to read literature around improving one's ability actually to empathize and to think about what are other people thinking, and just thinking about how that relates to developing civic virtues, and recognizing actually that reading literature has a special place in developing people, and how they relate to others in the community. And so figuring out not just what the books are to read, but how to make sure we're opening up that space for people seems important to this conversation.
I'm not going to name a book, but I do want to make sure that when we think about the civic purposes of schooling, that we don't confine ourselves just to thinking about the United States. As you know, the United States is one country among many in the world, and so as we think about the literatures that we'd want to read and the kinds of conversations that we'd want students to have, it would need to be also reading literatures from outside the United States, reading documents from outside the United States. And so in fact, I'll contradict myself. I will name one thing, which I think might be, say, the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
So Kitty now has the microphone because we need to hear your question, and Jim is next, Blue Blazer.
I'm Jim Colmoose from Edge Consulting, and this is a great panel. Earlier today at the Press Club, there was a report released by the Commission on Youth Voting and Civic Knowledge that Circle sponsored. And they were really focused on voting and youth engagement, and how there's a serious problem still today with youth voting and civic engagement. A lot of it was focused on civic education not being able to adapt to changing times, the way I interpreted their results. But they viewed, I think, the implication was that good citizenship means voting and youth engagement. As you all are referring to the civic purposes of schools, what is your definition of good citizenship?
Okay, these are all softballs. Definition of good citizenship, most important text.
So I think that Circle actually has a fairly broad notion of it. My conception of good citizenship is that people, all of us who live in a place together, will work together for what we perceive as being the common good. Now, in every way, that will be contested, right? But that people will care about what we do publicly and together, will know what the levers of power are in order to try to address important problems, will be capable of working with others in order to use those levers of power, whether those are within government, within civil society, through other means, civil disobedience, whatever, to try to make change, economic engagement, and so forth, who have the disposition and the capacity to listen to others in order and to be open to, in fact, having their minds change and to broadening their perspectives, who know how to compromise, right? Who will not push and push and push till it's pointless, but who have the capacity to work productively with others in order to bring about meaningful, worthwhile, positive change in society. And so that has to include voting, and it has to include many, many other things.
I would say that voting is clearly a necessary but far from sufficient condition of good citizenship. And it is important to understand it that way, because I think reducing citizenship to voting really eliminates much of the richness of what it should actually involve in terms of engagement with one's community and one's nation. I would also point out that that voting itself has become a contested area in our society in a way that I don't think any of us would have imagined 10 years ago. That we wouldn't, in our schools and in our country, put in every effort to get more people to vote and to make it easier for them to vote. There clearly is a counter movement, which even on something as simple and as fundamental as this has been, is now throwing that open to political contestation.
I just add to what Myra said. The people, beg your pardon. It's spelled in a way that could be pronounced several different ways. Thank you, Mira. Possessing the knowledge to know what it is you're voting on. The background knowledge. You go into the voting booth these days and you might be faced with 10 referenda as well as a whole bunch of people whose names you don't even recognize. Well, voting is a swell thing to do, but what if you don't have a clue what any of this is about, or who these people are, or what they stand for, or what those referenda mean? And it doesn't just mean boning up the day before with the help of a voter's guide. It means actually possessing the background knowledge of how things came to be the way they are. And then you can exercise your civic capacities wisely. And I think it also needs to be said before we go gaga over voting that though I do it conscientiously, increasingly it doesn't seem to matter. Where I live, you know who's going to win before you go into the voting booth on all the statewide and district-wide issues, because it's predetermined by the primaries, the caucuses, or the conventions, because our development of largely one-party districts and increasingly states in the United States, and safe seats all over the place at the state and national level, has left it largely immaterial who you vote for, at least in the general election. It might matter in a primary election. And when there are choices to be made, like school board in Montgomery County, Maryland, I'm damned if you can get any information about the candidates. There's no way to find out what they're for. unless you have nothing but 3 weeks to spend attempting to research their personal histories. There's just no voter guide on that stuff. So, so with due deference to the fact that it's an NEA district, let me say I look to see who the teachers union in Montgomery County has endorsed for school board, and I vote for the other guys.
All the way in the back, lady in the orange. Oh, it's you.
My name's Connie McKenna, and I work here at the AFT. And I'm curious, in putting the Common Core and the C3 together, the people who did it, was there any conversation about the much larger question of sending kids out into the world to experience this? I find it almost heartbreaking, actually, to listen to the conversation, because having grown up in New England with a very active family, I know that everything I learned about politics was at the dinner table. Election day was more exciting than Christmas because we were all knocking on doors. My mother was a Goldwater girl. And we went back and forth from right to left and left to right. And I think that's the source of activism for teenagers. But what we're all describing and committed to here is, what are kids going to be reading? And what really works for kids, especially teenagers, is getting out on the street. But there's so many dangers in that now, I think, with all the political challenges that we have. So as part of this curriculum, was there a consideration of how to use student clubs, local referenda, student newspapers? There's controversy around all of that, even saying those things. Was there an awareness that none of this matters if the kids aren't actually doing it?
Okay, that sounds like one for you.
So having sat in those conversations for 3 years, I'll say that if you look, say, on page 62 of the C3 framework, this is the end of the inquiry arc, and it's taking informed action. We have that by the end of grade 12, students will, say, apply a range of deliberative and democratic strategies and procedures to make decisions and take action in their classrooms, schools, and out-of-school civic contexts. That, I think, is just huge. That breaks down the barriers between the walls of the school and elsewhere, and it specifies that states that adopt this, and we have Republican-oriented states and democratically oriented states that are, that are considering adopting this, that students will actually go out and take informed action. If you look right above, that students will assess options for individual and collective action to address local, regional, and global problems by engaging in self-reflection, strategy identification, and complex causal reasoning. This, I think, this is not only about reading, right? This is actually quite different. On this, I also want to say that the emphasis on taking informed action is huge. And so to direct you back, and I'm going to use this as my opportunity to respond to Checker's claim that there's just no content here. So to direct you back to dimension 2 of the standards, the frameworks, which begin around page 30, that say, I'm right now on page 32, in civics, we expect that students by the end of grade 12 will explain how the US Constitution establishes a system of government that has powers, responsibilities, and limits that have changed over time and that are still contested, that they will evaluate citizens and institutions' effectiveness in addressing social and political problems at the local, state, tribal, national, and or international level, et cetera. And there's very strong economic knowledge, geographic knowledge, et cetera, and this is in the interest not only of having students read about other citizens doing stuff, but actually about their behaving as citizens and practicing citizenship themselves.
Thanks. I know we have several questions. Want to get some of our guests, so you'll be next. But I also want to note that our president, Randy Weingarten, has just walked in. And Randy, I don't know if that means you would like to say a few words or ask a question. We've been having a terrific discussion with this panel. I can also let you think about that for a minute, if you will, and take the next question.
Hi, my name is Joy Hatham, and I write books on American history and on science and other things. And what makes my books unique is that I have kid parents read my manuscripts, and so I work with children. I kind of know I can tell you, yes, I want my kids and grandkids to read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But I don't know any child who gets a high reading those things. But nobody has talked about Huckleberry Finn or
I did talk about Huckleberry Finn.
Moreover, he's my cousin.
But anyway, why aren't we paying more attention to the stories in our history? Richard Feynman, the great physicist of all time in America. Most physics courses are taught without ever mentioning him. His great classic, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. Every high school student should do that, and there's so many stories in American history.
Okay, who wants to take the question that's in there?
That's a softball for you.
Well, why don't we just praise Joy's textbooks as a model of whatever you care to call them. You can use them in, I believe, how many grades? Is it K-12? Is it K-8? No, what grades are you intending them for in science and U.S. history? What grade span?
I would say from third grade, maybe some college classes.
Okay, middle and high school. Very, very good works, full of meaty content and well presented, and vastly better than most of what passes for social studies textbooks, or science for that matter.
I can't see who's attached to the hand, but I see one way in the back.
Hi, my name is Mark Cebulski. I'm about ready to roll out an LLC called Great Teaching because in the midst of all this conversation, that's been lost. At any rate, I taught high school in Wisconsin for 30 years. I taught history and government, and I was known for a course on the history of American diplomacy and foreign policy and the military, focusing on the 20th century. Now, you'll have to trust this, but I did factual teaching about World War I, about as thoroughly as you're ever going to do it, World War II, Korea and Vietnam, and all the connections in between. I mean, I worked it hard. And I heard the other day from a student who ended up at the Naval Academy. He's finished now, beyond it about 3-4 years. He got back to me on Facebook. He didn't say, I remember your lectures on World War I, and I remember your lectures on Hitler, the Treaty of Versailles. He didn't remember that. He said, I remember your lecture on power, which was the first one he heard. What is it? What are their components? And why is it different than influence? And I believe strongly that we are about to see who exactly has power, if anybody does at all.
Can we get a question for the
I am getting
panel?
to that moment.
We're eagerly awaiting it.
My question is this. Am I remembered as a mediocre teacher because this young man didn't remind me of what he learned specifically about the wars of the 20th century? Or is it more important to him in the long run to know about a concept like power and how crucial it is as its application to just about everything in civic life we understand?
Thank you. Let's start.
So let me say that you can't teach a concept of power in the abstract. It has to be grounded in particular contexts, historical, social, cultural. So yes, I think, what a student will take away from a study of power or any other kind of central concept in history and social studies is the broad dimensions of it, if we're lucky, all right? Because often a lot of stuff is just lost. But I would also insist that, just as you don't analyze literary figures in the abstract, but in the context of actual pieces of literature. That when you teach these sorts of concepts, they do have to be grounded in the actual history which gives rise to them.
Looks like nods of agreement. on that. I'm going to ask Randy to say a couple of words. Who looks, I will, as I turn over the microphone to her, I would say she looks no worse for the wear of spending a night in jail. Randy. Exactly.
Speaking of civil disobedience and the role of civil disobedience in doing something, because the Congress, in some ways, is so disappointing that in some ways we did civil disobedience last night or yesterday to try to get attention paid to immigration reform again. And you know, the fact that you actually have to do civil disobedience, and it's not enough for 1 or 2 people to get arrested, we have to have 200 people get arrested. And I was the last of the people being processed, so I got out of jail at 6:30 this morning. But that gentleman's question, and so I'm sorry that I missed most of this panel, but this is that gentleman's question, and I suspect that there's agreement on this panel, but I want to ask it in this way. So I believe, like Leo, that you actually have to, that knowledge is a necessary but insufficient condition in order to get to the kind of classes and experiences that kids remember and we remember as school teachers. The application, the critical thinking, the problem solving, the piece that I'm very big on these days, the perseverance. You have to create knowledge in order to have engagement. You have to create a sense of confidence in order for kids to know that if they stumble and fall, they can get up. And so it is actually shocking to me, except for one respect, this crazy debate about the Common Core. And I would actually like your thoughts about why have we gotten into a debate that is so polarizing. Set aside the Tea Party, but for everyone else, why are we in such a polarizing debate about something which has such a potential to actually answer that gentleman's question about how you actually get to discuss power as professionals in teaching a subject that kids would really remember. I think the Common Core gives us that potential. Why are we in the situation we're in? Again, I have a lot of answers to that, but I'd actually like to hear from the panel what you think it is.
I don't actually think we're arguing about the Common Core. I think the Common Core is the current kickball in a larger game with teams on the field needing something to kick, and this happens to be what they're kicking this month or this year. There's a sort of version of polo that's played in Afghanistan. I think it's called bush kazee, where they use a dead sheep to hurl from their horse to the guy on the next horse who's supposed to catch it. I actually have come to believe that the Common Core is the current dead sheep, and it is being hurled around by teams that have other things to fight about.
I think there's some truth in that. I think that the polarization around the Common Core is rooted in the general political polarization, and then we have to try to analyze why that happened and why areas where there once was a kind of bipartisan consensus, like civics education, have become areas of contention, or like voting. And so, you know, and I think that's a complicated question, you know, and there's a lot of dimensions to it. Certainly one of the dimensions, as Checker said earlier, is that we've created at least a national political system where there are few true contests, for example, the House of Representatives. And so the kind of forces that would pull people towards consensus have actually been replaced by centrifugal forces which pull us apart. But that's only one dimension. There's many dimensions to it, but I do really truly think that this is not a question that can be separated from the larger political polarization.
So just quickly on that, I agree that I think it's just in some ways it's the issue that's just a vehicle for the polarization, for the mistrust in government that's just so present in other ways. But I guess it makes me think two things. One is, so then we actually need to be strategic about then how we make the case for folks about this. And I think Rick Hess has written, I think, a series of really interesting, provocative essays about how Common Core got folded into some of the big initiatives from the administration, and did that give it too much of a partisan character? And we can say that's unreasonable, or it certainly didn't have to be that way, or we can look to historical antecedents where it didn't play out this way. But we have a pretty unique context right now, and I think it just means we have to be strategic about how we talk about it, what people understand it to be, because that's ultimately what it's going to be in reality. The other. And of course, I mean, we certainly spent some time about those big challenges, but also, I mean, in just the bigger public conversation, right? It's going to matter how well we do it, but it's also going to matter what people even think this is, as to how much running room we have. And I just want to point to something that I remember from the book that I think David Campbell wrote this section, but that Mira, I think you co-edited, and it talked about that we have successfully made the case to people that poor academic performance has economic consequences, not just at an individual level, but for our society. And we need to figure out how to make the case for folks that poor civic education has consequences for our democracy. Because I don't know that people have that very present in their minds. So this seems like just kind of a nice thing to do, but not necessarily the quality of the democracy we get is inextricably linked with the quality of civic education that we provide.
I was trained as a political theorist before I became an 8th grade teacher. And I'm going to answer fairly abstractly as a political theorist by saying I think that the proxy war that the Common Core right now represents is potentially indicative of right now a national split between those who are most concerned about negative liberty. This is Isaiah Berlin's formulation, which is understood crudely as freedom from interference. And those who, on the other hand, are proponents of positive liberty, freedom to do things. And I think that as we think about the Common Core, right now, it is seen by those on the right, who are right now, I think, are in at sometimes associated with the negative liberty proponents, concerns about impeding freedom from interference, as being heavy-handed, right? And those on the left, on the other hand, are concerned about their freedoms to educate in certain ways that they favor, that they worry that the Common Core is, representing something hegemonic that's going to prevent critical education, whatever. And I think that I don't understand the Common Core as violating either negative or positive liberty. But I think that it is a proxy for similar fights that are now happening around the environment, around the economy, around politics, around transparency, around national security, all of which I frankly find fairly baffling about why they have the ideological cast that they do. I don't understand right now why conservatives seem generally to be more sanguine about the increase of the national security apparatus and the potential of developing a police state, given that conservatives usually have been very good at defending our freedom from interference from the national government, right? It's just kind of a bizarre ideological thing right now. Just as it's bizarre how the environment has taken the ideological cast and how education has taken an ideological cast. But when I think about it in those terms of when we're worried about our negative versus our positive freedom being infringed.
So we have time for one more question from one of our outside guests, and then we'll go to really very brief closing comments because we are about at the end of our time. Okay.
Thank you. Oh, okay. My name is Jeremy Thomas. I'm a former New York City teacher in math, science, and social studies. And my question goes back to the content, and I apologize, it has a little setup, but I'm gonna be really quick. As a science and social studies teacher, I remember many times when there was a huge desire in me to remove whatever the curriculum was and teach directly to what was happening. If I was in the classroom this week, my whole curriculum would be thrown away and it would be completely on the shutdown and what furlough means and what is the government. And so my question is, when we talk about the introducing in the Common Core skills-based standards versus assessments that are almost 100% directed on content, what do you say to a teacher who wants to do that? What do you say to a curriculum or a school that wants to implement that? Because to me, that's really what I'm interested in is how do you find that line to give the freedom but also create that collection of texts that we want to have our graduates know? Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll just quickly try and answer that a little bit. So as we talked about, the Common Core isn't actually what's going to necessarily get in the way of that, because there's actually, frankly, so little content there. But I think we do have to actually figure out what is the core knowledge, to borrow the term from that particular curriculum and framework. What is the core knowledge we expect students to have? And how do we discipline ourselves so that that's a manageable amount, and it doesn't mean that that's 180 days of instruction that you've got to take just to get through that, so that it does leave, some judgment and flexibility about where are we going to go deeper or where are we going to veer from this. But so I guess two practical things is, one, I think we need to make those decisions. We need to recognize it's political, and we need to figure out where is there the expectation that it's going to be across. And the second is we need to have assessments that get at these higher level skills. If the assessment is going to be the map of all of that content and just a set of, do you know this discrete fact, do you know this discrete fact, can you pick the right answer here, I think it's not going to encourage the kind of teaching that you want. And we got to figure out a balance there. I think one of the things that I'm worried about is the teacher evaluation work in Common Core ought to come together in lots of mutually reinforcing ways. But so if you're a social studies or a science teacher and you've got tests that don't test these literacy skills that we've talked about in your discipline, then I don't think it's actually encouraging you to have these deeper conversations and make sure students are ready to analyze and process and discuss and debate. So we need to make sure that the assessments students are taking in that are giving us the answer to this question of, is all of this working for students, are really hitting on these things so that they get prioritized and teachers make the space for it.
Let me answer that with an illustration, because I think part of the problem is, as I said before and Ross just said, curriculums which don't allow, just by their sheer volume, don't allow to do much. But I think there's also, there's a way to take a standard curriculum and make it pertinent. That is something that we really need to help our teachers be able to do. And my example is that when I would teach global studies and I was teaching Augustine and I was teaching Islam, I would teach their theories of just war. That's what we would focus on, the theories that they had of a just war. And we would apply those to the situations that were very much going on in terms of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. So there is a way for teachers to do this, but it's not something that a teacher will just look at this, say, Augustine, boy, that's a real opportunity to and that's where the issue of professional development, the issue of curriculum, the issue of teaching materials, the issue of teachers having time to sit and talk with each other about how to do that, that's where that all comes into play. And when those pieces are there, then we're able to take things and make them really live, pertinent issues, so we don't have to go away from global studies to address what's going on in the world.
Quick word on this, and then we should wrap
Yeah,
up.
very quickly, two things. One is, I think that the kinds of assessments that Ross was talking about early in the game that I was mentioning, that are dynamic, that are potentially computer mediated, that offer students the possibility of talking to simulated or even real others in real time to debate issues is one way in which the assessments might align with the kind of stuff that you would want to do. Because I agree, I would have dropped everything and focused on the furloughs, et cetera. The other thing, though, is slightly more radical, which is to say this may be a reason not to assess in civics. So we like to try to create assessments that will lead to the kind of teaching that we want. That's very, very difficult. We've gone the wrong way much of the time. And so I write about this actually in one of the chapters of my book, No Citizen Left Behind. I actually think that we are more likely to have better civics education if we do not assess in civics, at least not until we get much better at assessment.
Sadly, what has been a really interesting and wide-ranging discussion is coming to a quick close. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just give a final word on anything they'd like related to the civic purposes of education and or the Common Core. And we're going to do that in the reverse order from which we started, which means that Checker gets the first brief last word. Could you pass the microphone down?
Well, thanks. This has been good. We have left an awful lot for the implementation stage, the implementation and assessment stage. And what we've got in the Common Core, and incidentally also in C3, is basically a statement of aspirations where we would like to see the kids at the end. It doesn't tell us how to get there, much less get us there. And the heavy lifting of assessments and curriculum and teacher preparation and all the other things largely remains ahead, both with respect to the Common Core and with respect to civic education. I appreciate Mira's pointing out to me not only the correct pronunciation of her name, but also one of the few pages in C3 that has content in it. I ardently yearn for the days when there are high-quality civics curricula available for people to actually apply in their classrooms.
One of the things that's interesting about the literature around civic engagement is that we tend to think of political partisanship as a bad thing. But in fact, students and adults become more politically engaged when they have a clear political identity, when they know what they believe in and what they can act on. And I think a lot of our discussion around civics education suffers from the same sort of flaw, where we think somehow we need to have a civics education which is free from politics, and which will miraculously give us, you know, a kind of divine grace that we can move from, and I think we need to understand that politics is of the very core of this, because you can't teach American history or world history or civics without having at its foundation some core belief, some core view of what it means to be American, what it means to be a global citizen. And the sooner that we can engage those political conversations in a healthy way, I think the sooner we will actually come to the sort of consensus that'll be able to move us forward.
Yeah, so let me build on that and just reflecting on the question that came about teaching about the shutdown. I mean, I was even since then just reflecting on, so how do you create the space for it? But there's also this huge capacity building that needs to go on to help teachers recognize how to get into that conversation that doesn't deny the politics, but actually engages students in thinking about and recognizes that actually you need a lot of content and background knowledge to really assess what's going on, and there are actually valid arguments on the different sides, and then you can have that conversation. So I think I'll end with just where I started, which is I think that baked into the Common Core in its design, in its content, is a huge opportunity to strengthen civic education in American public schools. But it's not one that's just going to happen on its own. So I think I would encourage folks to dig into the Common Core and see where those levers are for strengthening civic education, to make that case, and then to think about, you know, and I talked about that kind of teachers need to practice those kinds of discussions. They need to practice them with each other probably before they're, or at least at the same time they're practicing with students, because I think this is a big lift to try and really change the kind of experiences, the kind of education we want students to have, so they're better prepared for that active civic engagement And so I just encourage folks to dig in, because I think the Common Core is a huge opportunity in this regard.
I'm going to focus on the C3 standards and hope not to be defensive. When I was asked to serve on the writing team, I told them, and I kept saying that I assumed these were going to fail and be actually, a disaster. But I also knew that if they failed, it would be another 25 years before people tried again, and by then I would be heading toward retirement. And if they succeeded, it would be at least another 25 years before anybody did anything again, because there would be such shock that they had actually gotten somewhere. So that this was the one opportunity in my professional life to try to change the experiences of children in the United States at scale with respect to social studies education broadly, but civic education in particular. And I want to highlight two virtues that I think that these C3 frameworks achieve. One is that they are oriented towards a theory of change in the classroom. What is it that would push teachers to teaching differently and actually enable them to, and give them the strength and the power to go to their principals or their district leaders or their states and say, look at what we're being asked to do. How do I do this? Help me do this, and this is important. And I think it does push towards much more active knowledge. The one other thing that I will say is that in that respect, it builds on what we know about civic engagement among adults, which is that adults do not go generally from being passionate and knowledgeable about a problem to getting involved. Instead, what the way they go is from being engaged to learning about a problem and getting passionate about it. What happens is that neighbors, family members, ministers, friends, office mates invite others along to participate in something, a party, a rally, a march, a talk, a whatever. And it's through the process of participation that people build the identity and the knowledge and the skills, and they become the kind of person who does this work. And in that respect, I think we need to think about flipping, therefore, how we conceive of civic education in schools, which is, again, engaging children in the work as a regular, ongoing basis, as a way of helping them develop the identity and knowledge and skills to be lifelong active citizens.
Thank you. Well, to borrow Ross's words, what we've been talking about is indeed a big lift, as is anything to do with raising and implementing standards and restoring and assuring civic purposes of education. But I think this panel has done a tremendous job in the last little while to help us think about how we can handle that lift together. I want to remind you that these panels will be happening once a month. The next one on November 13th is on the equally uncontroversial issue of quality assessments for educational excellence. On behalf of the Albert Shanker Institute and the American Federation of Teachers, I really want to thank our guests for coming and for participating in the conversation, and I want all of you to join me in thanking our terrific panel.